Dawn crept across Port Moresby on March 3, 1943, painting the tropical sky in shades of orange and gold. Major Edward Larness gripped the control column of his B-25 Mitchell bomber, his hands moving with practiced precision as he monitored the fuel gauges. The twin Cyclone engines thundered beneath the fuselage, their rhythmic roar filling the cramped cockpit. Through the scratched plexiglass windscreen, slightly smudged from months of operations, he could count 11 more bombers tucked in tight formation behind him. Their propellers carved silver arcs through the humid morning air, catching the early light. The Japanese convoy somewhere below had no idea what was about to unfold. In the next quarter hour, everything they thought they knew about fighting at sea would crumble. The bombing technique about to be unleashed was so radical, so unconventional, that military strategists had practically declared it suicide. The mathematics of destruction would be written not in the old language of high-altitude precision bombing, but in a new vocabulary of violence, measured not in thousands of feet, but in mere feet above the ocean surface. 200 feet. That was how low Larners and his squadron would descend, screaming across the water at speeds between 250 miles per hour. Low enough to feel the salt spray on their faces, low enough to see the enemy sailors who would be scrambling below them. The Japanese had departed. Rabaul convinced their convoy sailed under adequate protection. 8 destroyers and squadrons of 0 fighters were supposed to guarantee safe passage. They were about to discover that the rules of naval combat had fundamentally shifted. The transformation had begun 2 months earlier, when Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, made a fateful decision. Throughout the previous year, American bombers had struggled miserably against Japanese shipping. Flying from altitudes of 5 to 10,000 feet, bombardiers watched their weapons streak uselessly past maneuvering targets. The explosions sent impressive geysers of water skyward, yet actual hits remained frustratingly rare. The numbers told a grim story. During one convoy interception attempt in January, American pilots flew 416 sorties and managed to sink just 2 ships while damaging 3 more. The Japanese were resupplying their New Guinea garrisons with minimal interference, and the entire Pacific War hung in precarious balance. Kenney was not a man who accepted conventional limitations. A fighter pilot from the First World War, he had built a reputation for daring innovation. He grasped the fundamental problem. Conventional bombing doctrine failed because ships could dodge. When a bomb fell from 10,000 feet, ship captains had nearly 60 seconds to turn their vessels away, present narrower targets, or slip between cascading ordnance. The answer demanded a radical shift. Bombers would need to attack from altitudes so dangerously low that evasion became impossible. Yet flying within a few hundred feet of heavily armed warships contradicted every principle of bomber survival. Anti-aircraft gunners at that range would have ideal firing solutions. A single burst could obliterate an aircraft instantly. The stakes seemed impossibly high, but Kenney had heard whispers of an unconventional technique that might transform everything. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had experimented with skip bombing during the nights of October 22nd and 23rd, 1942, at Rabaul. His bombers released their ordnance at extreme low altitude, and the bombs bounced across the water surface like skipped stones, detonating beneath or inside target vessels. The principle was elegantly straightforward. If a bomber approached at extreme low altitude and released delayed fuse bombs at high speed, those weapons would skip across the waves before punching into enemy hulls. Ben had proven the tactic functioned in actual combat, but he perished on January 18, 1943, when his B-17 vanished over New Guinea before he could develop the method for large-scale daylight operations conducted by entire squadrons. No one had yet attempted coordinated full-squadron attacks. No one had engineered the necessary modifications for medium bombers to survive at masthead height. No one had drilled complete units in the split-second precision required for skip bombing while enduring savage enemy fire. Until now, Major Paul Gunn emerged as the architect of the modified B-25, a former naval aviator whose own wife and children remained trapped in the Philippines following the Japanese invasion. Gunn possessed both mechanical brilliance and personal motivation born from rage. His team, working from primitive maintenance facilities at Port Moresby, stripped the nose turret from B-25 Mitchell bombers, and installed 4 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. They added additional weaponry along the fuselage until each aircraft bristled with 8 to 12 heavy machine guns, all oriented forward. The result was essentially a flying battleship, capable of pouring withering fire into targets while closing for bombing runs. These guns served multiple critical purposes. First, they suppressed enemy anti-aircraft fire by sweeping destroyer decks clear of gun crews. The heavy 50 caliber rounds could perforate destroyer hulls, disable gun emplacements, and generate chaos throughout target vessels. Second, the nose guns transformed the entire aircraft into an aiming mechanism. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where bombardiers calculated intricate trajectories, this low-altitude approach required pilots to fly directly at targets and reference a simple windscreen marking as their gun sight. When the pilot aligned this marker with the target ship, the bomb release followed. The method was brutally straightforward and demanded steel nerves, yet the modified aircraft represented only half the solution. The other half required training pilots to operate at suicidal altitudes with flawless timing. That responsibility fell to Edward Lanus, who assumed command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron in late December 1942. Lanus was thick-shouldered and muscular, a pilot renowned for aggressive tactics and unshakable nerve. He habitually wore a weathered service cap cocked back on his head. His pilots respected him because he never asked them to attempt anything he wouldn't personally lead. When Kenny explained the concept and showed him the modified aircraft, Lanus responded predictably. His men would train relentlessly, and they would not fail. Training commenced in January 1943 using the SS Pruth, a British steamer that had run aground on the rocks near Port Moresby on December 31, 1923, and lay rusting in the harbour. For weeks, B-25 crews descended to 200 feet and released practice ordnance toward the corroded hull. Each pilot expended 30 to 40 bombs while mastering windscreen reference markers instead of traditional bomb sites. When one crew struck the wreck's mast and spiraled into the water, killing everyone aboard, the squadron attended the funeral service and returned to training the following morning. Lanus drove his men mercilessly because he comprehended the stakes. The Japanese were cementing their grip on New Guinea, constructing airfields that threatened Australia's security. American and Australian ground forces endured brutal jungle combat against enemies who refused surrender. Every Japanese convoy that reached New Guinea delivered additional troops, ammunition, and supplies that would ultimately cost Allied lives to overcome. Stopping those convoys at sea remained the only viable option. By late February 1943, the 90th Squadron had achieved readiness. Lanus reported to Kenny that his pilots were a confident group who would strike with precision. Days later, the opportunity arrived. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on the evening of February 28, 1943. Allied codebreakers had intercepted and decoded the convoy intelligence, revealing its destination and estimated arrival window. Lae, New Guinea. 8 transport vessels carried 6,900 troops required to strengthen Japanese positions. 8 destroyers, formidable warships equipped with extensive anti-aircraft armament and experienced crews, provided escort. The Japanese command believed the convoy would traverse safely. The route hugged New Britain's northern coast, seeking shelter within storm systems that would provide cloud cover. Experienced captains commanded each vessel, understanding defensive principles. Voyage timing had been carefully calculated to minimize air attack exposure. Every contingency had received consideration, but the Allies were watching continuously. Reconnaissance sorties tracked the convoy from departure. On the afternoon of March 1st, a B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the ships through a cloud break at approximately 3 o'clock. The crew transmitted coordinates and course information. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, this intelligence activated an extensively prepared response protocol. Kenny mobilized his assembled forces. Heavy B-17 Flying Fortresses would initiate the attack from medium altitude, scattering the convoy and compelling evasive maneuvers. Then the primary assault would commence. Modified B-25s from the 90th Bombardment Squadron, A-20 Havocs from the 89th Attack Squadron, Australian Beaufighters bristling with cannon and machine guns. All would attack at masthead height in successive waves, designed to overwhelm defensive capabilities. The Japanese faced industrial-scale low-altitude warfare for the first time. March 2nd opened with disappointment. Cloud cover obscured the convoy throughout daylight hours. B-17s dispatched to engage found only clouds and vacant ocean. Evening brought clearing skies. By dawn on March 3rd, reconnaissance crews relocated the convoy steaming through the Bismarck Sea toward New Guinea. The formation positioned itself precisely 50 miles southeast of Finschhafen, exactly where Allied planners had predicted. Kenny issued the attack order. All units would engage. The engagement was commencing. Lannes assembled his squadron commanders for final briefing. The tactical approach required different aircraft attacking from varying altitudes simultaneously, fragmenting defensive fire and creating confusion. B-17s would descend from 5 to 7,000 feet. Beaufighters would maintain wave-top altitude. The B-25s would arrive behind the Beaufighters at 200 feet, employing forward guns to neutralize anti-aircraft fire before delivering ordnance. Lannes's instructions remained direct. Locate your target. Approach fast and low. Use your guns to clear the deck. Skip your bombs into the hull. Exit rapidly. Elements of 3 or 4 aircraft would execute attacks with wingmen, providing suppressing fire, while lead pilots concentrated on bombing runs. Approaches would come perpendicular to ship sides, parallel to vessel length, maximizing target dimensions and optimizing angles for bomb skipping. Precision timing remained absolutely critical. Release too early and bombs would bounce past targets. Release too late and the aircraft would position directly above the ship when delayed fuses detonated, destroying both bomber and crew. Error tolerances measured mere fractions of seconds. At 8:55 a.m., the message arrived. The convoy had received positive identification and remained within striking distance. Lannes shouted commands to his squadron. Cape Ward Hunt, 0930, let's go. Engines ignited with tremendous roar. Modified B-25s began their taxi toward the Port Moresby runway. Behind them, 20 A-20 crews from the 89th Attack Squadron prepared to follow. The strike plan required all attacking aircraft to assemble over Cape Ward Hunt at 9:30 and commence assault at 10 miles. As Lannes's B-25 climbed skyward, the New Guinea coastline receded behind him. Before him lay open ocean and a Japanese convoy unaware of its peril. The flight consumed less than 1 hour. At 10,000 feet, formation flying proceeded smoothly with excellent visibility. Lannes observed other strike force elements assembling. Heavy B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group climbed toward altitude. P-38 Lightning fighters positioned themselves as top cover, prepared to intercept any Japanese fighters attempting interference. Australian Beaufighters, twin-engine machines mounting 2 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns each, dropped toward wave-top level. Everything aligned with textbook precision. At 9:55, lead B-17 pilots spotted the convoy. 16 Japanese vessels became visible, their wakes leaving white trails across the blue Pacific. 8 large transports steamed within a protective screen of 8 destroyers, maneuvering to provide anti-aircraft coverage. It was an imposing force, and Japanese captains believed themselves prepared for any assault. At 10 a.m. sharp, the first B-17s commenced bombing runs. Flying at 7,000 feet, they released 1,000-pound ordnance that descended in long arcs toward the convoy below. The Japanese response erupted instantly and violently. Destroyers and transports unleashed every anti-aircraft gun they possessed. The sky transformed into a maelstrom of exploding shells. Tracer fire streaked upward in brilliant streams. One transport absorbed a direct hit and began listing immediately. Another caught fire, black smoke billowing skyward. The overwhelming majority of those high-altitude bombs fell short of their targets, throwing up enormous plumes of seawater that swamped the vessels but inflicted no real damage. The Japanese commanding officers allowed themselves a moment of relief. This was standard bombing, the kind they'd trained for and could manage. They believed they could weather it. Then the Beaufighters appeared on the horizon. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters came screaming in at wave height, moving faster than 300 miles per hour as they hugged the ocean surface. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews, hardened through countless drills tracking high-altitude bombers, suddenly confronted an entirely different problem. These targets were sliding across their field of fire horizontally, moving with terrifying speed. The Australian pilots didn't hesitate. Their Beaufighters unleashed devastating bursts of firepower. 20mm cannon rounds shredded through the metal of destroyer superstructures, tearing jagged holes in steel. Machine gun fire swept across transport ship decks, catching sailors and soldiers in merciless streams of lead. The heavy cannons punched through armored positions as if they were paper. Japanese personnel scrambled desperately for whatever shelter they could find, while the Australian aircraft roared overhead, leaving wreckage and confusion in their path. The Beaufighter assault lasted mere minutes, yet it accomplished exactly what was intended. The convoy's tight defensive arrangement started coming apart. Destroyers, thinking the low-flying Beaufighters might be torpedo bombers, swung their bows forward to offer smaller profiles, a textbook maneuver against such threats. But this tactical move had an unintended consequence. It left the transport vessels far more vulnerable. Right into this deteriorating situation came Lana and his B-25s. The squadron approached from the southeast, holding altitude at 2,000 feet, which gave each pilot sufficient time to pick out targets and plan their bombing runs. Through his windscreen, Lana surveyed the pandemonium below. Ships twisted and turned in wild, evasive maneuvers. Thick smoke poured from vessels already struck by B-17 attacks. He fixed his sights on a massive destroyer and pulled his control stick backward. His B-25 tilted forward into a controlled descent. At 200 feet altitude, Lana leveled his wings and shoved the throttles to maximum. The bomber surged forward, reaching 225 miles per hour. The ocean raced past, barely separated from his landing gear. His three wingmen stayed in formation beside him, each positioning themselves to strike different ships. Lana powered up his forward weapons. At 200 yards distance, he pressed the firing button. The 50 caliber machine guns mounted in his B-25's nose roared to life, hurling streams of half-inch rounds toward the destroyer. The destruction was immediate and horrifying. Japanese sailors standing topside went down in the first seconds. Gun emplacements detonated in violent sprays of sparks as armor-piercing ammunition tore through steel plating. The destroyer's bridge windows exploded inward. The enemy ship descended into pandemonium as gunners struggled to return fire while streams of bullets tore through their bodies and equipment. Lana maintained his heading with laser precision, keeping his targeting reference point locked perfectly on the destroyer's waterline. His co-pilot called out the diminishing distances as they closed in: 500 yards, 400 yards, 300 yards. At the calculated moment, Lana's bombardier released two 2,500-pound bombs equipped with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs separated and immediately plunged toward the water. The delayed fuses meant they wouldn't explode on initial contact. Instead, these weapons would skip across the ocean surface like stones, momentum carrying them forward. The first bombs struck the water, bounced upward, then crashed directly into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The second bomb followed the same trajectory, hitting the water and skipping straight underneath the vessel. Lana hauled back on his control stick, and his B-25 cleared the destroyer's mast with mere feet separating them. His gunners in the waist compartments kept firing, sweeping their weapons across the destroyer's deck as they passed overhead. 5 seconds later, when Lana's B-25 was already a quarter-mile distant, the delayed fuses detonated. Two massive explosions erupted across the destroyer's frame. The first blast tore an enormous opening in the hull exactly at the waterline. The second explosion, igniting beneath the keel, shattered the destroyer's spine. The vessel began sinking immediately as water rushed into compartments faster than the damage control teams could seal them. Behind Lana, his wingmen carried out their own devastating runs. Lieutenant Charles Howell targeted a transport, his machine guns clearing personnel from the deck before his bombs skipped directly into the ship's side. Captain John Hennebree, commanding the second pair of aircraft, fired continuously as he swept toward another transport, his tracer rounds walking steady lines across the ship's structure. One of Hennebree's bombs struck directly amidships. The transport lurched from the explosion, flames shooting from its cargo holds. Lieutenant John Small made his attack on yet another vessel, driving 2 bombs into its hull while dropping 2 additional bombs across another ship's forward section. Throughout the convoy area, B-25s executed flawless bombing runs. The tactic perfected during practice sessions at Rabaul was finally proving itself on a grand scale. The Japanese simply couldn't mount an effective defense against such overwhelming speed and violence. Anti-aircraft gunners found enemy aircraft already upon them before they could acquire proper aim. The overwhelming 50 caliber machine gun fire from the B-25s made manning exposed gun positions virtually suicidal. Any sailor who attempted to fight back was immediately cut down by concentrated fire. The water-skipping bombs themselves were extraordinarily destructive. Unlike high-altitude ordnance that ships could sometimes evade through maneuvering, these weapons came in too fast and too low to avoid. Before lookouts could even identify an incoming B-25, the bombs were already released. Ship captains could only watch helplessly as bombs bounded across the water directly toward their vessels, striking hulls with tremendous force before the delayed fuses detonated and sent explosions ripping through critical compartments. Following the B-25s came 12 A-20 Havoc light bombers from the 89th Attack Squadron, also flying at wave height. Major Glenn Clark led the first formation of 6 aircraft, and as they approached the convoy, he could see the explosions and flames from earlier attacks. Clark selected a large freighter and commenced his bombing run. Flying at 200 feet while maintaining 240 miles per hour, Clark fired his weapons and released 2 bombs. The weapons skipped flawlessly, striking the transport and igniting massive fires. Clark's wing clipped the ship's radio antenna as he pulled upward, yet his A-20 remained under control. Banking around, he observed his target, later identified as Taimei Maru, burning intensely from multiple direct hits. Other A-20 pilots achieved similar success with their attacks. Captain Ed Chudoba attacked the same freighter Clark had struck, making certain of its destruction. Captain Dixie Dunbar and Lieutenant Jack Taylor targeted Kembu Maru, the convoy's smallest vessel. Their bombs found their mark, and the ship commenced sinking almost immediately. Overhead, P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters that had arrived to defend the convoy. The aerial engagement was furious, though brief. American pilots flying superior aircraft in speed and firepower systematically shot down enemy fighters with methodical precision. 3 P-38s were destroyed during the fighting, but their sacrifice meant the bombers could continue attacking without interference. Any Japanese fighters that penetrated through to attack the B-25s and A-20s discovered the bombers' defensive guns were far from helpless. Waist gunners and tail gunners aboard the American aircraft returned fire with intensity, and several Japanese fighters fell to defensive fire from the bombers themselves. By 10:15 a.m., just 15 minutes after the assault began, all 8 transport ships had sustained damage, with most actively sinking or burning. 3 of the 8 destroyers had been severely damaged or were already going under. The Bismarck Sea contained debris, spreading oil slicks, and Japanese sailors jumping overboard. The American and Australian flight crews, witnessing the devastation from above, could scarcely comprehend what they were seeing. The technique they'd drilled for weeks had surpassed all projections. The low-altitude bombing wasn't merely effective. It was catastrophic. The convoy that had departed Rabaul with such confidence was being methodically annihilated. Yet the engagement continued. The Japanese displayed characteristic determination, and the remaining destroyers persisted fighting even as transports burned around them. During the afternoon, Allied aircraft returned for additional strikes. The subsequent wave replicated the morning's devastating assault pattern. Additional B-17s bombed from medium altitudes, while B-25s conducted precision low-level runs. By 3:36 p.m., 8 transport ships and 3 destroyers rested on the Bismarck Sea floor. One destroyer drifted helplessly throughout the night before finally sinking at dusk on March 4th. Only 4 destroyers escaped intact: Shikinami, Asagamo, Yukikaze, and Uranami. Even these surviving vessels sustained significant damage. The human toll proved staggering. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops who left Rabaul destined for Leh, merely roughly 1,200 reached shore. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul. However, most had abandoned or lost their weapons and supplies. Approximately 2,190 Japanese soldiers and sailors perished, either trapped aboard sinking vessels or drowning in the oil-covered waters. For the Allies, casualties remained remarkably modest. 13 American and Australian air personnel died. 10 fell during combat operations, while 3 died in a separate accident. 8 airmen sustained wounds. 4 aircraft were lost in combat. 1 B-17 and 3 P-38s. 1 B-25 and 1 BO fighter crashed in accidents. Against 12 Japanese ships destroyed and thousands of enemy troops eliminated, the casualty ratio seemed almost impossible. The aftermath proved deeply troubling and haunted numerous participants throughout their remaining years. On March 4th, Allied aircraft and PT boats swept the waters where the convoy had been obliterated, hunting for survivors. The commands were merciless and crystal clear. Machine gun the lifeboats, strafe the rafts. Guarantee that Japanese soldiers couldn't reach New Guinea's shores where they might be rearmed and redeployed into combat. The strategic logic was brutal but straightforward. Each Japanese soldier reaching New Guinea would eventually require American or Australian infantry to kill him in horrific jungle combat. Better to end them in the water than confront them again in the jungle. However, those executing the order found themselves deeply affected. Pilots recounted witnessing gatherings of 200 survivors clinging to rafts and receiving orders to fire until no survivors remained. PT boats sprayed machine gun fire at Japanese personnel in the water throughout the night. American commanders justified the order by referencing Japanese atrocities and military expediency. During the bombing assault, Japanese Zero fighters had strafed American airmen who bailed from a damaged B-17 designated Double Trouble, shooting them as they descended in parachutes. Allied troops fighting across New Guinea had witnessed Japanese soldiers using prisoners for bayonet training, engaging in cannibalistic practices, and choosing suicide to surrender. The harsh realities of Pacific combat made compassion seem like an impossible indulgence for either side. Yet the aircrew who executed attacks against survivors wrestled with the experience. Many carried the psychological weight for decades. They comprehended the military rationale. They possessed knowledge of Japanese brutality, yet firing at defenseless men floating in ocean water contradicted something core in their understanding of combat. General Douglas MacArthur described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the decisive aerial engagement across the Southwest Pacific Theater. His assessment proved accurate. The battle demonstrated that land-based aircraft could obliterate naval convoys independently, without surface ships or carrier support. It established that low-altitude bombing constituted a reliable, dependable tactic, not a desperate improvisation, but a technique worthy of systematic training and refinement. Most significantly, it severed the sea routes supplying New Guinea. Witnessing the annihilation of the Ley convoy, Japanese commanders abandoned any further attempts to resupply New Guinea garrisons through naval transport. The isolation of Japanese forces became complete, making their eventual destruction inevitable. For Edward Larner, the brilliant innovator who orchestrated and commanded these operations, the triumph represented the pinnacle of his military service. He had seized a tactic tested in small-scale operations and perfected it through demanding, methodical training. Subsequently, he led his aviators into combat and witnessed outcomes surpassing even his most optimistic projections. The bombardiers in Larner's B-25s had struck with stunning precision, landing 17 bombs directly on their targets from the 37 they released. The accuracy they achieved left high-altitude bombing tactics in the dust. General Kenny recognized their brilliance immediately, pushing hard for Larner's advancement and recommending him for the highest military honors. The 90th Bombardment Squadron became the stuff of legend throughout the entire Pacific Theater, their name whispered with respect and awe. Yet tragedy was waiting in the wings. Larner would never witness the war's conclusion. On April 30th, 1943, barely 8 weeks after his magnificent victory at the Bismarck Sea, his life ended in a terrible flying accident. As he approached Dobodura Airfield, He executed the move he'd performed countless times before, the daring dive toward the runway, followed by a sharp climbing turn. It was his signature maneuver, always thrilling, always carrying an edge of danger that he'd managed to escape through dozens of attempts. But this approach would be different. This time, his bomber carried far too much weight. Fuel tanks were topped off, 8 passengers occupied the cabin, baggage and tools lined the cargo hold, and 2,000 pounds of bombs sat loaded in the bay. The aircraft groaned under the burden. When Lana pulled back hard on the control column at the lowest point of his dive, the straining aircraft had no choice but to stall. It tumbled into a flat spin, cartwheeling down toward Earth in sickening rotations before slamming into the ground with a terrible impact and erupting into a fireball. Not a soul survived the crash. He left behind a grieving wife and 2 daughters who would grow up without their father. The military gave him a full funeral with all the honors befitting an officer and hero, conducted at Port Moresby with full military ceremony. His immortality was already secured by those 15 minutes of flying that permanently altered naval warfare. Wing Commander John Hennebury, who had flown as one of Lana's wingmen during that historic attack on the Bismarck Sea, stepped into his shoes and assumed leadership of the 90th Squadron. Under his command, the unit carried on through the remainder of the war, continuing to employ the methods Lana had so brilliantly refined. They went on to send dozens of Japanese warships to the bottom as 1943 and 1944 unfolded. Hennebury himself climbed the ranks, eventually earning promotion to Major General and ultimately becoming President of the Air Force Association, where he spent the rest of his career preserving and advancing the innovative spirit and fearless leadership that Lana had demonstrated to all who flew under his command. The revolutionary tactics tested at the Bismarck Sea began spreading like wildfire across the Pacific. Squadron after squadron converted their B-25s into heavily armed gunships, installing forward-firing cannons and machine guns that could rake targets with devastating firepower. A-20 units adopted the same low-level attack strategy as their standard approach for striking enemy shipping. The technique jumped theaters altogether, appearing in the Mediterranean, where American bombers employed it against German and Italian vessels. Even the British, who had experimented with comparable methods earlier in the conflict, studied the American results and developed their own refined version. The impact on Japanese naval commanders was profound and unsettling. Officers who had once commanded warships with reasonable confidence, assuming destroyer escorts and air cover provided adequate protection, now understood they were exposed to attack from which they could neither escape nor mount an effective defense. The convoy system that had kept isolated Japanese garrisons supplied across the sprawling Pacific suddenly became impossible to maintain wherever Allied land-based aircraft could operate. Japanese strategists were forced to adapt their entire supply structure, shifting to submarines and high-speed destroyer runs conducted under the cover of darkness, accepting drastically reduced cargo capacity and accepting dramatically increased risks in the process. The battle vindicated General Kenny's bold strategic thinking completely. His conviction that standard bombers could be radically modified for unconventional roles, his openness to unorthodox operational approaches, and his talent for recognizing and elevating aggressive combat leaders like Lana all proved to be the decisive factors. His philosophy of air power became the template for how to employ aviation effectively across the theater. Kenny showed conclusively that creativity and flexibility could compensate for disadvantages in numbers or geography. The 5th Air Force, serving under his direction, achieved and maintained air superiority across the Southwest Pacific, making possible MacArthur's ambitious strategy of island hopping. The technical innovations proved equally valuable. Aircraft manufacturers learned that medium bombers possessed far greater flexibility than original designers had conceived. The B-25 Mitchell, engineered originally as a conventional medium-altitude bomber, transformed into one of warfare's most adaptable platforms, once converted into a heavily armed gunship. The concept of forward-firing weapons would influence the design of attack aircraft for generations after the war ended. The fundamental doctrine of combining suppressive fire with precision weapons became central to close air support training. For the pilots and crews who participated, the experience was profound and transformative. They had trained relentlessly for a mission that seemed almost impossible to accomplish. They had flown through anti-aircraft fire so intense it nearly seemed solid. They had released their bombs with microsecond precision while racing along at speeds that offered no margin whatsoever for mistakes. Against all odds, they had triumphed beyond anyone's wildest hopes. That victory gave them a confidence that persisted through their remaining military service. Men who had harbored doubts about the tactics before launching that first attack became its strongest advocates afterward. Crews who had been uncertain about diving at enemy warships at just 200 feet became hungry for additional missions. The 90th Squadron developed a distinctive culture and esprit that positioned it as one of the Pacific's most formidable units. Analysis of the battle's statistics reveals the stark superiority of low-altitude approaches versus the traditional high-altitude method. The B-17 bombers attacking from altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet managed to achieve only about a 3% success rate, consistent with what was considered acceptable in practice but wholly inadequate when aiming at moving targets. The B-25s and A-20s operating at 200 feet using the innovative technique achieved hit rates exceeding 50%, with some crews placing hits on nearly every single bomb they dropped. Multiple factors explained this dramatic difference. The shorter distance meant targets had less time to react and change course. The horizontal trajectory required far less critical timing than dropping from altitude. The suppressive fire degraded the enemy's capacity to defend themselves, and the shock of fast-moving aircraft at virtually mast height disrupted coordination of defensive responses. Creating the technique required resolving many intricate technical problems. Bombs needed delayed fuses capable of withstanding the initial water impact without detonating prematurely. The delay interval had to allow aircraft time to escape the blast, yet still detonate at the crucial moment to destroy the target. Through extensive trial and error, pilots discovered that releasing at precisely 200 feet while traveling between 200 and 250 miles per hour produced the most reliable results. Even small variations spelled the difference between success and failure. A deviation of merely 20 feet in altitude or 10 miles per hour in speed could cause bombs to sink away without skipping or to bounce harmlessly beyond the target. The precision demanded was extraordinary, built through hundreds of practice passes and the instinctive skill of experienced aviators who could feel altitude and velocity in their bones. The converted B-25s themselves represented an impressive accomplishment of improvised engineering. Major Paul Gunn and his ground crews performed modifications that the B-25's original manufacturer had never contemplated. Installing the additional armament required structural reinforcement. Electrical systems had to be designed from scratch to fire multiple machine guns in coordinated bursts. Ammunition storage for thousands of rounds of .50 caliber bullets required creative solutions using whatever materials and tools were available. That these hastily devised modifications functioned dependably in actual combat spoke volumes about the cleverness and commitment of the maintenance personnel. Many worked 18-hour shifts day after day to keep the aircraft mission ready. They scavenged components from destroyed planes. They fabricated custom mounting brackets from scrap materials. Through sheer stubborn determination and resourcefulness, they kept the B-25s in the air. The battle equally demonstrated intelligence work's critical importance in modern combat. The Allies prevailed only because codebreakers had disclosed the convoy's intended route and destination. Reconnaissance pilots had successfully tracked the ships despite terrible weather conditions. Communication systems allowed squadrons dispersed across enormous distances to coordinate their strikes. The fusion of intelligence gathering, reconnaissance operations, and attack capability displayed the transformation of warfare into something increasingly dependent on technology and information. The Japanese convoy's failure wasn't due to incompetent commanders, but because every element of the operation had been compromised by the Allies' superior intelligence network. Within the wider context of the Pacific War, the Bismarck Sea battle signaled a turning point for the New Guinea campaign. Japanese defenders on the island, already struggling against Australian and American infantry advances, now faced complete isolation from reinforcement and resupply. The garrison at Lae, which this destroyed convoy was meant to reinforce, would fall to Allied assault forces 6 months afterward in September. Japanese positions contracted steadily as island after island succumbed to American amphibious landings backed by dominant air power. The command of the skies enabling these invasions rested on breakthroughs achieved that day over the Bismarck Sea. The battle demonstrated that the Allies could control not merely the skies, but the surrounding waters through resourceful application of land-based aviation. The human component of this battle warrants remembrance and recognition. Beyond casualty counts and ship tonnages lay personal narratives of exceptional bravery and ultimate sacrifice. There was the B-17 crew forced to bail from their burning aircraft, only to face a hail of bullets from Japanese fighters as they descended helplessly beneath their parachutes. There were the P-38 pilots who gave their lives protecting the bombers, diving into overwhelming fire to shield the slower attack aircraft. There were Japanese sailors remaining at their anti-aircraft positions even as their vessels came apart around them. There were American and Australian air crews conducting mission after mission, knowing that a single error at 200 feet would be fatal. War extracts courage from all sides, and this battle witnessed extraordinary acts of bravery displayed by both forces. The controversy surrounding attacks on survivors remains complicated and contested. Military historians generally view it as militarily sound within the context of total war in the Pacific. Each Japanese soldier eliminated at sea represented an Allied life saved when those troops would have fought on land. Given Japanese military culture that viewed surrender as dishonorable and death in combat as the expected conclusion, allowing survivors to reach shore guaranteed future casualties. Yet the ethical questions remain troubling. Attacking defenseless men in the water challenged traditions of military conduct respected for centuries. The argument that Japan would have done the same and had committed worse atrocities doesn't fully resolve the moral questions. Some who participated struggled with those memories throughout their remaining years, while others maintained they simply did what combat demanded. Military scholars analyzing the battle have identified numerous crucial elements contributing to the Allied triumph. Tactical innovation born from operational challenge solved the problem of hitting fast-moving vessels. Intensive realistic training prepared crews for actual battle conditions. Coordinated operations utilized different aircraft types, working together in complementary fashion. Superior intelligence supplied target information and enabled effective planning. Aircraft modification adapted standard designs for specialized requirements. Each component was vital. When combined, they proved sufficient for decisive victory. The battle functions as an instructive example of how innovation, training, intelligence, and coordinated operations can overcome numerical or technological obstacles. Lana's legacy stretches far beyond his abbreviated lifetime. His readiness to pursue an unproven tactic and his ability to prepare his men to execute it flawlessly preserved countless Allied lives. Each Japanese soldier lost in the Bismarck Sea represented an enemy that American or Australian ground forces would not encounter in the New Guinea jungle fighting. Every warship sent to the ocean floor meant one fewer cargo shipment of weapons and ammunition destined to kill Allied soldiers. The attack method Lana pioneered became the standard approach for anti-shipping missions across the remainder of the Pacific War. Countless Japanese merchant vessels and warships fell to low-level bombing over the succeeding 24 months. Japan's maritime lifelines, essential for maintaining its sprawling empire, were methodically destroyed by planes flying at altitudes traditional military thinking considered essentially suicidal. Decades afterward, survivors gathered at reunions and recounted their participation with simultaneous pride and amazement, proud of their accomplishments, amazed they had lived to tell the story. Those 15 minutes spent at mast height, traversing through torrents of anti-aircraft bursts and releasing ordnance with split-second accuracy, represented the most intense minutes of their entire lives. They often spoke of it as traveling through the very depths of hell. Still, they emerged as victors. Their methods had proven effective, their courage had been demonstrated, their historical significance was secured. The principles established and proven at the Bismarck Sea maintain their relevance to contemporary military strategy. Innovation transcends ordinary limitations. Realistic preparation readies forces for genuine combat. Combining separate capabilities creates integrated results exceeding individual components. Adapting current systems to address emerging challenges accomplishes results quicker than developing entirely new solutions from scratch. Intelligence properly exploited creates insurmountable advantage. These discoveries, validated over the waters of the Bismarck Sea 8 decades past, continue shaping how modern militaries prepare and conduct operations. The identities of those who participated are gradually becoming lost to time, yet the principles they demonstrated through sacrifice and bravery continue guiding each generation tasked with protecting freedom. The Bismarck Sea battle ranks among the Pacific War's most significant turning points. A Japanese convoy meant to arrive safely and complete its supply mission was instead completely obliterated through tactical innovation executed with exceptional precision. The approach that achieved this outcome was condemned as virtually suicidal by those adhering to conventional military doctrine. Lana and his pilots demonstrated that conventional wisdom offered insufficient answers. They flew at heights that courted annihilation, timed their bomb releases with zero margin for miscalculation, and accomplished results that surpassed every prediction. 12 Japanese transport and warships descended into those waters. Thousands of enemy servicemen perished. The approach to New Guinea was sealed shut, and the war's momentum shifted decisively toward eventual Allied triumph. All accomplished in merely 15 minutes of intense combat, showcasing the force of valor, vision, and resolve. The approach deemed forbidden became standard practice. The perilous method became ordinary. The supposedly impossible feat became the blueprint for countless subsequent victories. Lana did not witness the Pacific War's conclusion, yet his imprint on that ultimate victory remains immeasurable. The aviators who followed him into battle at 200 feet carried his influence with them. The methods he developed and perfected caused the sinking of hundreds of Japanese ships during the subsequent 2 years. The example he set through his fearlessness encouraged thousands of aircrew facing equivalent dangers. His memory belongs alongside history's greatest innovators, the commanders who transformed military conflict through bold imagination and courageous action. The Bismarck Sea engagement stands as his crowning achievement, its principles continuing to resonate through subsequent generations, confronting fresh difficulties requiring the same blend of tactical thinking, thorough training, fearless action, and absolute commitment that marked those 15 transformative minutes over the Pacific in March 1943.